What if Africa's gold reserves became more powerful than the dollar itself? Imagine a world where Africa, not Wall Street, sets the price of gold. For the first time in history, that reality might be closer than we think. Right now, as you're watching this video, there's a quiet revolution happening across the African continent. It's not happening in boardrooms in London or New York. It's happening in the gold mines of Burkina Faso, the refineries of Uganda, and the economic planning rooms of visionary African leaders who refuse to accept the colonial playbook that has impoverished their nations for generations. This isn't just about gold. This is about the fundamental restructuring of global economic power, and the Western financial establishment is absolutely terrified. For over 5 centuries, Africa has been the world's treasure chest, yet somehow its people remain among the world's poorest. This paradox didn't happen by accident. It was engineered, maintained, and perpetuated by a system that ensured African resources flowed outward while profits flowed elsewhere. But something extraordinary is changing, and the implications reach far beyond the mining sector. Let me paint you a picture of what's really happening here. For decades, Western banks and institutions have controlled gold pricing through mechanisms like the London Bullion Market Association and COMEX futures trading. Even though Africa holds 40% of the world's gold reserves, nearly half of all the gold that exists on this planet, the continent has rarely benefited from this astronomical wealth. Instead, African nations have been relegated to the role of raw material exporters, shipping unrefined gold or to European and American refineries, where the real value is added and the real profits are made. This system has been so entrenched that many people assume it's natural. But there's nothing natural about a continent rich in gold having some of the world's poorest populations. That's the result of deliberate economic structures designed to maintain dependency. Enter the new generation of African leadership, and this is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Uganda recently announced the discovery of 31 million tons of gold, or worth over $12 trillion at today's prices. To put that in perspective, that's more than the GDP of China and the United States combined. But here's the twist that has sent shockwaves through international financial markets. Instead of selling it off cheaply to foreign corporations, Uganda is building its own state-of-the-art refinery. President Yoweri Museveni, despite his flaws and legitimate criticisms regarding governance, made a strategically brilliant decision. Rather than following the traditional playbook of shipping raw materials abroad, Uganda chose to add value domestically. This means Ugandan engineers, technicians, and workers will process the gold. Ugandan businesses will benefit from the supply chains. Ugandan communities will see direct economic impact. And most importantly, Uganda will control the pricing and marketing of its finished gold products. This represents a seismic shift from the extractive colonial model that has dominated African economics for centuries. But Uganda isn't alone in this revolution. Burkina Faso, under the dynamic leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, has taken even bolder steps. The 35-year-old leader has systematically expelled foreign mining corporations accused of exploitation and implemented policies ensuring significantly higher state control over gold production. Traoré represents a new generation of African leaders who understand that true sovereignty requires economic independence, not just political independence. When Burkina Faso terminated mining permits for several Western companies and demanded better terms for new partnerships, international media portrayed this as instability and anti-business sentiment. But from an African perspective, this represents exactly what genuine leadership looks like, prioritizing national interest over foreign corporate profits. Traoré's approach reflects a sophisticated understanding of resource economics. Instead of accepting whatever terms foreign companies offer, Burkina Faso is negotiating from a position of strength, demanding technology transfer, local employment quotas, and significantly higher revenue shares. This isn't anti-foreign investment, it's pro-African development. The ripple effects are spreading across the continent. Ghana, already Africa's largest gold producer, has been quietly implementing policies to increase local processing capacity. Mali has renegotiated several mining contracts to ensure better terms for the state. Even South Africa, with its complex mining history, is experiencing renewed discussions about beneficiation, the process of adding value to raw materials before export. But here's why this terrifies Western financial institutions. Gold is far more than just jewelry or industrial input. Gold is the backbone of global finance, the ultimate store of value, and historically, the foundation of monetary systems. Throughout history, whoever controlled gold pricing controlled significant aspects of international finance. The Bretton Woods system, which established the dollar's dominance after World War II, was originally based on gold convertibility. Even after Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility in 1971, gold remains central to international reserves and financial stability. If African nations start pricing and selling gold independently, bypassing traditional Western-controlled markets, it fundamentally weakens the dominance of the dollar and the euro. More critically, it creates alternative centers of financial power outside Western control. Consider the mathematical reality. If Africa's 40% of global gold reserves were processed, refined, and marketed through African institutions rather than Western ones, it would shift hundreds of billions of dollars in annual revenue from Western financial centers to African economies. That money would build African infrastructure, fund African education systems, and capitalize African businesses. But the implications extend far beyond individual national economies. Whispers of a gold-backed African currency are no longer mere speculation. There are serious policy discussions happening in African Union corridors and economic planning ministries across the continent. The East African community has been discussing monetary union for years. The West African Monetary Union already exists but currently pegs to the euro to the problematic CFA franc system that many economists describe as modern financial colonialism. A gold-backed African currency, or even multiple regional currencies backed by African gold reserves, would represent the most significant monetary innovation since the creation of the euro. More importantly, it would provide African economies with genuine monetary sovereignty for the first time since independence. Imagine conducting international trade without needing dollar or euro intermediation. Imagine African countries settling payments in currencies backed by their own gold reserves. Imagine the psychological and practical impact of African currency being sought after by international investors specifically because of its gold backing. This isn't fantasy, it's entirely achievable with current African gold reserves and production capacity. The Western response has been predictable and revealing. International media coverage focuses on instability and investment risks rather than acknowledging legitimate African desires for economic sovereignty. Credit rating agencies issue warnings about policy uncertainty when African governments assert greater control over their resources. International financial institutions express concern about business environment deterioration when African leaders prioritize national development over foreign corporate profits. But here's what they're not saying. This represents the single greatest threat to Western economic dominance since the end of the Cold War. For centuries, the global economic system has been structured around raw material extraction from Africa and value addition elsewhere. African labor produced the raw materials. European and American factories processed them. Western financial institutions finance the operations. Western markets determine the prices. And Western consumers enjoy the finished products, while African producers remain trapped in poverty despite sitting atop enormous wealth. This system generated trillions of dollars in wealth, but very little of it remained in Africa. The current gold revolution threatens to fundamentally disrupt this arrangement. When African nations process their own gold, they capture the entire value chain. When they control pricing and marketing, they determine their own economic destiny. When they potentially back currencies with their gold reserves, they achieve genuine monetary independence. From a continental perspective, this transformation connects directly to the broader African Renaissance that's been building for decades. The African Union's Agenda 2063 explicitly calls for economic transformation and industrialization. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, now operational, creates the policy framework for increased intra-African trade and economic integration. Continental infrastructure projects like the Programme for Infrastructure Development in Africa are building the physical foundation for economic independence. Gold provides the financial foundation for this transformation. African gold reserves, properly managed and processed, could finance continental infrastructure, capitalize Pan-African development banks, and provide the monetary backing for truly independent African currencies. The youth dimension of this revolution deserves particular attention. Across Africa, young people represent the largest demographic segment and increasingly demand leaders who prioritize African interest over foreign approval. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who explicitly appeals to Pan-African consciousness and economic sovereignty, represent this generational shift in political expectations. Young Africans see no reason why their continent should remain poor while sitting atop 40% of the world's gold. They question why African currencies should be pegged to European ones when Africa has superior mineral reserves. They demand leaders who think strategically about resource management rather than simply accepting whatever terms foreign corporations offer. This generational consciousness creates political pressure for the kind of bold economic policies we are seeing in Burkina Faso, Uganda, and increasingly across the continent. The media narrative around these developments reveals the depth of Western anxiety about African economic independence. Notice how international coverage consistently frames African resource control as nationalization with negative connotations, while similar policies by Western nations are described as strategic resource management or national security priorities. When Norway maintains state control over oil resources through Equinor, it's called sound economic policy. When African nations assert similar control over gold resources, it's portrayed as dangerous populism. This double standard reveals the underlying assumption that African resources should remain available for foreign exploitation while Western resources deserve protection. But African leaders and populations increasingly reject these double standards. They recognize that genuine development requires control over resource extraction, processing, and marketing. They understand that economic sovereignty isn't anti-foreign investment, it's pro-African development. The regional dynamics of this transformation are equally fascinating. East African nations are coordinating approaches to mining policy and monetary integration. West African states are increasingly questioning the CFA franc arrangement and discussing alternatives. Southern African nations with substantial mineral wealth are exploring greater economic coordination. These regional approaches multiply the impact of individual national policies. When Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Mali coordinate gold policies, they represent a significant portion of global gold production. When Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya align economic strategies, they create a substantial regional market. When South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe coordinate mineral policies, they influence global commodity markets. Continental coordination through the African Union provides even greater leverage. African nations collectively control not just gold, but also significant reserves of platinum, diamonds, uranium, cobalt, lithium, and rare earth minerals essential for modern technology. Coordinated resource policies could fundamentally alter global supply chains and pricing mechanisms. The technological dimension adds another layer of strategic importance. Modern African gold processing facilities don't just refine metal, they incorporate advanced technologies for environmental protection, quality control, and integrated supply chain management. These facilities create high-skilled employment, technology transfer opportunities, and industrial capacity that extends beyond mining. When Uganda builds gold refineries, it's also building technological capacity, training engineers, and developing industrial expertise that applies to other sectors. When Burkina Faso demands technology transfer as part of mining agreements, it's building long-term developmental capacity, not just extracting immediate revenue. This technological development connects directly to broader African industrialization goals. The same technical skills needed for gold processing apply to electronics manufacturing, precision engineering, and advanced materials production. Continental gold processing capacity becomes the foundation for broader industrial transformation. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this revolution is its demonstration of African agency and strategic thinking. For too long, international discourse has portrayed African leadership as reactive, dependent, and incapable of long-term strategic planning. The current gold revolution completely contradicts these stereotypes. African leaders are making sophisticated calculations about resource management, monetary policy, and international economics. They are implementing complex strategies that balance immediate revenue needs with long-term developmental goals. They are coordinating policies across national boundaries to maximize collective leverage. And they are doing all of this while facing intense pressure from established international interest. This demonstrates intellectual sophistication, strategic vision, and political courage that deserves recognition and respect. The global implications extend far beyond Africa. If African gold-backed currencies become reality, they could provide alternatives to dollar-dominated international trade. Other Global South nations watching African success with resource control might implement similar policies. The entire post-colonial economic structure could face fundamental challenges. China's Belt and Road Initiative already provides alternative development financing outside Western institutions. Russian energy policies challenge Western energy dominance. Indian technological development creates new centers of innovation. African resource control adds another pillar to the emerging multipolar economic order. From this perspective, Africa's gold revolution isn't just about African development, it's about global economic transformation toward greater balance and reduced Western dominance. The environmental dimension deserves mention as well. Traditional foreign mining operations in Africa often prioritized extraction speed and profit maximization over environmental protection. African-controlled mining operations, answerable to local populations rather than distant shareholders, have greater incentives for sustainable practices. Burkina Faso's new mining policies explicitly include environmental protection requirements. Uganda's refinery plants incorporate modern environmental standards. When African communities control resource extraction, they are more likely to balance economic benefits with environmental sustainability because they live with the long-term consequences. This connects to broader conversations about sustainable development and climate justice. African nations shouldn't have to choose between poverty and environmental protection while wealthy nations build their prosperity through environmentally destructive practices. Through resource extraction that benefits local populations while maintaining environmental standards represents a more sustainable development path. Looking forward, the trajectory seems clear. More African nations will assert greater control over gold and other mineral resources. Processing capacity will continue expanding across the continent. Coordination between African nations will increase, and pressure for genuine monetary sovereignty will intensify. The Western response will likely intensify as well. Expect more international media coverage emphasizing investment risks and political instability. Expect credit rating downgrades for nations that assert resource control. Expect increased diplomatic pressure through international institutions and bilateral relationships. But also expect African resilience, strategic thinking, and determination to continue driving this transformation forward. The world is watching, but Africa is writing its own story. This gold revolution represents just the beginning of broader African economic transformation. When African nations control their gold, they demonstrate the possibility of controlling oil, uranium, lithium, cobalt, and other strategic resources. If gold is step one, what happens when oil and uranium follow? What happens when African nations coordinate policies across all strategic minerals? What happens when continental infrastructure enables truly integrated African economies? What happens when African currencies backed by African resources become preferred stores of value? Those are the questions that will define the next phase of this revolution, and that's exactly what we'll explore in our next episode. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the possibilities couldn't be more exciting. But this revolution succeeds only with awareness, support, and engagement from people who understand what's really happening. Every view, every share, every comment helps spread awareness about African economic sovereignty. When you engage with content that tells Africa's real story, you're participating in this transformation. So here's what I need you to do right now. Hit that like button to support this message of African economic independence. Subscribe to this channel because we are going to continue following this story as it develops. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our analysis of African sovereignty movements. And most importantly, share this video with everyone who needs to understand what's really happening in Africa right now. Your engagement directly supports the African sovereignty movement by ensuring these stories reach more people. When mainstream media ignores or misrepresents African development, independent content creators become crucial for spreading accurate information. Your likes, shares, and subscriptions make this possible. The revolution is happening. The question is, will you be part of spreading the word? Hit subscribe, hit like, and let's continue building awareness about Africa's journey toward genuine economic independence. The continent is rising, and the world will never be the same.